January 1946. Berlin is cold, the air heavy as if frozen in the ashes of war. The city that was once the pride of Europe is now a gray one, a giant cemetery of rubble, smoke, and memories. On the cracked streets, the acrid smell of burning steel and corpses still lingers, as if the war has never left. Germany, 1946. A year after the guns fell silent, the ghost of war still haunts every street. Orphans, mothers who lost their children, and women who have no more tears to cry. Berlin, the once proud city, is now only a symbol of sin, of punishment, and of souls trying to live again in the ashes. Amidst the rubble, a woman stands still. Her name is Clara Engel, 32 years old, a former nurse in the German army. When the war ended, she returned to Berlin, but there was nothing to return to. Her home was bombed to the ground. Her husband died on the Stalingrad front, and her 8-year-old son, Felix, went missing in the final chaotic days of the war. From then on, every morning, Clara walked through the devastated streets, desperately searching for a trace of her son. On her shoulder was a worn canvas bag. Inside was only a piece of hard bread, a few coins, and an old photo of Felix, the child with eyes as bright as the sky of Berlin before the war. That day, Berlin was covered in snow. Women like Clara still quietly pulled wooden carts, collecting rubble. People called them Trümmerfrauen, women of the rubble. No one ordered them to work, but they knew without them, this city would never come back to life. Each hoe stroke, each brick, each exhausted breath, all combined into the characteristic sound of a Germany trying to get back up from the ground. A skinny child ran by holding an empty can, looking for food in the rubbish. Clara stopped and called out to him, "Hey, little one, don't eat that, it's spoiled." The child looked at her, his eyes sunken, and softly replied, "I just want to live." His voice was so small that the wind blew it away. Clara fell silent, broke her piece of bread in half, and gave it to him. She didn't know who the child was, only saw in his eyes the shadow of Felix. In the evening, the bells of St. Nikolai Church rang out against the ash-gray sky. The old church had lost its roof, only the brick walls remained, but the bells still rang, distorted, heavy, like a prayer lost in the ruins. Clara looked up at the sky, her eyes red. "God, if you can hear me, please let me see my son again, just once." On other streets, American and Soviet soldiers patrolled. Berlin was now divided. Each neighborhood belonged to a different side. Germans like Clara lived in a mixture of fear. They no longer had a clear enemy, only guards, guns, and the cold stares of those who had fought with them. One evening, as Clara was looking for shelter, she heard a light knock on the door. Outside was another woman, short-haired, wearing a Soviet military jacket but with a tired, sympathetic face. "Are you from here?" she asked in hard German. Clara nodded. The woman opened her bag and handed out a can of canned fish and dry bread. "I don't need..." Clara hesitated. "Take it. I have a child too." "Somewhere. Over there," the Soviet soldier said, her eyes slightly sad. That small gesture, a person who was once an enemy, now helping others, was a rare thing that made Clara feel that this world was not completely dehumanized. Night fell. Clara sat alone in the half-collapsed basement where she had lived with her husband. The wind whistled through the cracks in the bricks, carrying with it the cold and musty smell. She opened the small photo, Felix smiling in his school uniform in front of the school gate. She remembered the morning in 1945 when the bombs fell on Berlin. Felix held her hand, but in the panic, the jostling crowd, the smoke, and the explosion separated them forever. "My son, I survived, but that means nothing if I don't find you." The next morning, Clara went to the black market near Potsdamer Platz. There, everything could be exchanged. Soap for medicine, bread for a coat, and sometimes information for money or a body. It was rumored that there was a group of children living in the sewers who specialized in collecting things from corpses. Clara went to a man nicknamed One-Eyed Muller and asked for information about Felix. He sneered, "An 8-year-old. In Berlin, miss, the whole city is full of dead children. What do you think?" Clara looked at him silent. He shook his head. "But if you want, I will ask. In return, you have to bring something." She replied, "I have nothing." He sneered, "Here, everyone has something to exchange." Clara turned away. She did not look back, only felt that she was living in a world without humanity, where people had become bargainers for each other's pain. After the war, Germany was no longer just a defeated country. It was a land torn between guilt and survival. The women like Clara, who did not hold guns, are the ones who bear the heaviest consequences. They do not fight with bullets, but with courage, to raise their children, to find their loved ones, and to keep their humanity. That afternoon, when the snow was falling heavily, Clara collapsed in the middle of the street. An old man helped her up and led her to the old cafeteria. He was Franz Becker, a former professor at Humboldt University who now made a living repairing clocks. He looked at Clara and shook his head. You can't keep searching in despair. Sometimes surviving is a way to remember, Clara asked. But if I don't find my child, what's the point of living? Franz mused. To tell, to let the world know who we were and what we lost. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She looked through the broken window and saw the dim light coming from the square. In the darkness, a few women were still working, clearing snow, collecting bricks, repairing the roof. She saw in them her own image, slender, strong figures, forgotten by everyone, but the last pillars of a people-broken clan. She said softly, "Perhaps we are the ones who have to rewrite history, not with paper, but with our hands and pain." Berlin, February. The wind cuts through the collapsed walls, scattering the charred remains of paper on the pavement. Each piece of paper is a fragment of the past. Certificates, love letters, old propaganda bulletins. They fly in the snow and ash, a reminder that memories are being carried away too. When the war ended, the Germans lost more than just their homes. They lost their memories, their faith, and themselves. The survivors now have only two choices: to forget or to continue remembering. Clara chooses to remember. She cannot forget, because to forget would be to betray the very child she is still searching for. Every day she rises before dawn, wraps a scarf around her neck, and heads west of the city. What was once the residential district of Friedrichshain, now a pile of rubble. They said there was a temporary orphanage there, where Allied soldiers gathered homeless children without papers or names. Clara had heard about this for weeks, but she didn't dare believe it. Until today, she decided to go. The road was long and cold. Military vehicles passed by, their wheels crushing the old snow, leaving black mud behind. She crouched on the side, hugging her woolen scarf. Another child, about 6 years old, sat huddled next to the rubble, his hands purple. She stopped, touched his shoulder gently. "What's your name?" The child looked up, his eyes dull. "They called me Number 7. Number 7. Clara was stunned. He had no name. In this world, people had been lost to the point that even their identity was just a number. She gave him half of her last piece of bread and walked away, her heart heavy. As she approached the camp, she saw a group of women standing at the gate. They had come to look for her child, too. One was wearing a worn brown coat, tall, with a cold face but sharp eyes. Her name was Ilse Reinhardt, about 30, a former soldier in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the Nazi women's youth organization. Now Ilse was what the occupation authorities called a suspicious woman. Watched, despised, shunned. Clara recognized Ilse by name. They had lived in the same neighborhood before the war. When she was young, Ilse had believed in the ideal of German purity, had marched under the swastika, had sung patriotic songs with great conviction. Now she stood in line, head bowed, shaking with her demobilization certificate. Clara looked on, saying nothing. Part of her wanted to despise her, but the other part felt only pity. Both were victims, though each had come through the war by a different route. The camp gate opened. An American soldier spoke loudly in German. "Those looking for children, line up on the left. There is a list. You can check it." His voice was hard, even, emotionless. Clara pushed forward. Her heart pounded when she saw hundreds of names scribbled on the paper. She searched. Felix Engel. Not there. She read it a second, a third, a fourth time. Still not there. Clara gripped the edge of the table, trembling. Ilse stood by, saw it, and said softly, "Maybe the boy is still somewhere." Berlin was now divided into 4 zones, each with a list. Clara asked softly, "Did you lose someone too?" Ilse nodded. "My sister, in the April shelling. No body found. 2 women, 2 worlds once opposed, now stand side by side, sharing the same pain. After the war, Germany was full of seekers, some searching for their children, some searching for their wives, some searching for their own souls. No one has everything. Only fragments of the past remain. But in that devastation, the women become the quietest witnesses, those who remember on behalf of an entire nation." That day, Claire and Ilse decided to go together. Yeah, They heard that in the northern part, near the Spree River, there was a small church where children often came to beg. It started to rain. The two of them, sharing a coat, walked through the flooded street. Under their feet, each broken tile reflected the flickering light of the oil lamp. Clara asked, "Do you regret having believed them?" Ilse was silent. After a while, she said softly, "I believed that I was serving my country. I did not know that my country would swallow its own people." The words fell into the rain, cold and piercing like a confession. When they reached the church, the door was closed. Inside was only a faint singing, a hymn. They pushed the door open and entered. In the dim room, a few children were huddled around the stove. An old priest was distributing soup. Seeing Clara, he asked, "Who are you looking for?" "My son, me." Felix Engel, 8 years old, brown hair, blue eyes. He shook his head, his eyes sad. "Here, every week there are some new ones, some dead. The war's over, but the journey of the children has not ended." He handed her another list, handwritten, smeared with tears. Clara read each line, still no Felix. Her hands trembled, her eyes blurred. Ilse put her hand on her shoulder, squeezed gently. Nothing needed to be said. Between the two women was an understanding without words. In the evening they stayed in the church. Ilse lit a fire. Clara helped the priest cook soup. Outside, snow fell silently. The children slept in groups. Some of them still had nightmares, screaming in their sleep. A little girl of about 5 years old sobbed, "Mom, don't leave me." Clara quickly hugged her, patted her back. Her tears wet the child's cheeks. "If you're gone, I'll hug the other children, the way the world hugs me on this cold night." The next morning, the priest whispered, "There's news that a convoy of children is going to the Soviet zone, near Potsdam. Maybe your child is there." Clara looked up, her eyes flashing. Ilse turned to her. I'll go with you. I have nothing to lose." Clara looked at her, hesitated, then nodded. They set off. Two women, two small shadows in the ruined city. Ahead lay the Soviet-controlled territory, filled with checkpoints, soldiers, and blocked roads. But Clara was not afraid. After all, the only thing that kept her alive was the faint hope that her child was still somewhere in this world. They did not know what lay ahead, but sometimes, just by walking, people did the most extraordinary because they carried with them a belief that in the ashes there was still a small life waiting for them. The route from Berlin to Potsdam was less than 30 kilometers long, but for Clara and Ilse, it seemed like an eternity. On the muddy road covered with old tank tracks and piles of burnt steel, they walked in silence. No one spoke, only the wind whistling through the burnt-out windows, the clanging of metal like the wailing of a dead city. In the winter of 1946, Germany was no longer a country, just a map torn into 4 pieces. Each piece was ruled by a different power, and the people, who had once cheered the war and were now just shadows wandering among the ashes. In the Soviet-controlled area, soldiers set up dense guard posts. Every citizen who passed by was asked for papers, searched. Even searched. Ilse walked ahead, her head slightly bowed, her demobilization certificate clutched tightly in her hand. Clara followed, holding tightly to her bag where her son's photo was hidden. When they reached the first checkpoint, a young Soviet soldier stopped them. He didn't say much, just looked at Ilse with cold eyes. Ilse's old badge was still faintly visible on her shirt, the torn eagle. He frowned, snatching the paper from her hand. "Frau Reinhardt, were you a soldier before?" the interpreter asked in German. Ilse was silent, then nodded slightly. "I was a logistics officer." The soldier read the file again, then looked at her for a long time. Finally, he just said, "Go. But if you get caught, we won't be able to guarantee anything." Ilse thanked her softly. They walked past the checkpoint, the cold wind blowing harder. Clara took Ilse's hand. "Thank you." Ilse just replied, "We're the same. We're both looking for something we've lost." When night fell, they reached a small village on the Spree River. This place had been a temporary German base, now abandoned. The houses had collapsed, leaving only a small church and an old army warehouse. They took shelter in the warehouse. Ilse lit a fire. The smoke stung her eyes, but the warmth made it easier for Clara to breathe. She took out a photo, a smiling boy holding a small wooden cart. Ilse looked at the photo and said softly, "He looks like his father." Clara nodded. "My husband died in Stalingrad. That's all I have left." Ilse was silent. After a while, she said, "I used to think that war was the way for women to be recognized, to contribute like men. But in the end, we were just tools. When the shooting stopped, they threw us away like old things. Clara looked at her eyes full of sympathy. They both understood women like them in the post-war period were forgotten by society. Well, not because they were a living memory of a past that people wanted to bury. The next morning, they heard noises outside. A convoy of Soviet trucks was stopping near the warehouse. Sick children were being unloaded, their limbs thin, their eyes sunken. An officer gave orders in Russian. A woman interpreter shouted, "Who has lost a child? Come out." There were 37 children on the list, newly brought from the south. Clara jumped up. She ran out, her heart pounding. The children lined up, torn shirts, bare heads, many of them unable to remember their own names. She looked at each face. One had brown hair. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Ah, Felix!" The child looked at her, shook his head. No. She continued searching, calling out the name in despair. Ilse stood beside him, looking around as if searching for someone too, perhaps her sister. But the wind blew so hard that her voice was carried away. After the war, there were millions of children like that. No nationality, no family, no language to speak of their fear. They were silent, just like the world was silent before their fate. A Soviet officer approached, looked at the two women. He asked, "Who are you looking for?" Clara handed over the photo. He looked at it, nodded slightly. This child might have been in the northern camp near Oranienburg, but that camp, no one is left now. Clara was stunned. "What did you say?" "The plague, then the fire. No one survived." She stepped back, her hands shaking. The photo fell to the ground, covered in mud. Ilse caught her, whispered, "Don't believe it. No one knows for sure these days." They left the village, continuing north. On the way, they met many people like themselves. Mothers holding photos, old people trudging along, disabled veterans. Each person had a story. Each face was a chapter of a book no one wanted to read. A book about the pain of Germany. That night, they stayed in a ruined chapel. Ilse took an old letter from her pocket. The paper was yellowed. She gave it to Clara. "This is the letter my sister wrote before she disappeared." Clara read, her voice trembling. "Ilse, if the war ends, I will come and find you. I believe that we will be forgiven." Clara looked up, tears streaming down her face. Ilse said softly, "I don't know who will forgive us. Maybe no one." Clara took her hand and whispered, "No one needs to forgive us. We just need not forget." In 1946, women like them were still walking through the wastelands, over collapsed bridges, carrying their pain, their faith, their memories. They did not find their children, but they found each other, and perhaps that is how people began to learn to live again. The road to Oranienburg had almost disappeared. The fields were covered in snow. There were no landmarks, no trace of a village that had once existed. Clara and Ilse walked for 2 days, past abandoned guard posts, past makeshift cemeteries, where hundreds of crooked wooden tombstones had the names of the dead hastily carved. The wind grew colder as they walked, but Clara did not stop. She believed that somewhere there was still a small light, even if it was just a name, an object, a proof that Felix had lived. Ilse followed, silent. She was no longer looking for her sister. Perhaps deep down, she knew the truth. Now, the only thing that kept her going was her only companion left in this ruined world. They said the war ended in 1945, but for people like them, the war continued, in memory, in fear, and in silence. Late in the afternoon, they reached the edge of the old camp. A rotten wooden sign leaned in the snow. Kinderlager Nord, Northern Children's Camp. No more fences, no more guards. Only burnt floors, a musty smell, and scattered children's things. A charred doll, a broken button, a few pieces of paper scribbled in childish handwriting. Clara knelt down, and with trembling hands picked up a small piece of fabric, the edge of a blue sweater, just like the one she had knitted for Felix. She brought it to her face, inhaled deeply. A tear fell, mixing with the snow. Ilse stood beside her, saying nothing. She just put her hand on Clara's shoulder, squeezing it gently. It was the first time since they had met that Ilse cried. Not because of her sister, but because she realized of all losses, the cruelest thing is not death, but having to live on to remember. They stayed in the camp all night. Inside the ruined room, Clara lit a small candle. The weak light shone on the wall, where someone had written in shaky German ran, "Mother, don't forget me." She touched the words with her hand, murmuring as if in prayer, "You won't forget, Felix." Ilse turned, her voice hoarse. Maybe he's looking at her, somewhere out there. Clara smiled sadly. I don't know, but if he's alive, I want him to know that his mother went to the ends of the world for him. In Oranienburg, mothers buried their children with their bare hands. There were no tombstones, no farewells, only snow and silence. But perhaps, in that silence, they heard what the rest of the world forgot to hear, the echo of love. The next morning, an American relief convoy passed through the area. It was the first time Clara and Ilse saw people in American uniforms. A young, blonde soldier stopped when he saw them. He gave them 2 loaves of bread and a can of condensed milk. Clara bowed her head in thanks. Ilse stared at the soldier. In her eyes, wariness, fear, and gratitude mixed with shame. The soldier smiled, speaking in broken German. "It's okay. Now, we're all human." The words were simple, but like a knife cutting through all boundaries. Clara burst into tears. She understood that war could erase cities, erase countries, but it could not erase the human instinct to save each other. The convoy left. Ilse and Clara sat on the burnt wooden steps, sharing a loaf of bread. Ilse whispered, "I used to think the Americans only came to occupy land, to punishment, but looking at them today, they must be tired too." Clara nodded. "Perhaps we are all victims of the same madness." In the afternoon, they walked together through the woods near the camp. In the middle of the woods, there was a small graveyard. Nameless wooden tombstones planted crookedly. Clara placed a piece of green cloth on one of the graves, whispering, "Even if you were not here, I would still come to visit." Ilse stood next to her, clasped her hands, her eyes looking far away. In that moment, in the quiet German woods, the 2 women were no longer enemies. They were pieces of a people learning to be human again. They left Oranienburg as dusk fell. In the distance, the sun was red as cinders. Clara turned back one last time, looking at the candle still burning in the old camp. The flame was small, but bright enough to light up the gray German sky. The narrator concludes the story. In 1946, Germany began to rebuild, but there are things that cannot be rebuilt with bricks and stones. Trust, memories, lost smiles. The world remembers the generals, the treaties, the statistics, but few remember women like Clara and Ilse. They did not hold guns. They did not have medals, but they retained the only thing that made people human: kindness in the ashes. Berlin, winter 1946. The houses are just rusted steel frames. The church domes are broken. The streets are covered with rubble. The city that was once the heart of the empire now only echoes with the cold wind through broken windows. But amidst the ashes, there are still weak breaths trying to rise, like small shoots growing on the burnt ground. Clara returns to Berlin after nearly a year in a refugee camp in southern Germany. Her footsteps stop in front of the ruins of her old house, where there used to be laughter, Felix's piano playing, and the smell of her mother's apple pie. Now only a bare wall remains, with someone writing in charcoal, "Wir leben noch," we are still alive. Clara smiles slightly, and the smile of someone who has seen too much loss, but still has not forgotten how to hope. She finds the Church of St. Nikolai, where the surviving women gathered every day to clear away the rubble, patch the roof tiles, and light small candles in the dark corners. They called each other Die Trümmerfrauen, the women in the ruins. There were no drums, no uniforms, only calloused hands and eyes that had witnessed the collapse of the world. It was said, after the war, only women understood what real loss was. The men either died or returned with incurable wounds. As for the women, they stayed to mend the country, brick by brick, pane by pane. Clara, in her worn-out coat, started cleaning with them. In the first days, she said nothing. She worked like a shadow, quietly, diligently, as if she were atoning for the whole nation. One January morning, when the snow was still falling, an American soldier appeared at the church gate. He was carrying a wooden box containing cans of powdered milk, flour, and a few bars of chocolate. The group of women stopped. No one dared to approach. Clara was the first to step forward. The soldier bowed his head and spoke slowly in broken German. "We don't want anyone else to die." Clara didn't reply. She just bowed slightly, then helped him put the box down on the brick floor. The first cans of milk were distributed to the children in the ruins. Soft laughter rang out in the cold winter, a sound Berlin had forgotten for nearly 2 years. Nameless Children Diary. Every evening, Clara sat by candlelight in the small room, a converted part of an old bomb shelter, writing in a leather notebook she found in the rubble. She called it Nameless Children's Diary. Each page contained the names or just descriptions of the children she encountered. A 6-year-old blonde girl looking for her mother in Mitte. A boy who couldn't speak, who could only draw the sun, huh? 3 orphans living in an abandoned train car. Clara wrote so she wouldn't forget. She told a friend, if we don't write it down, who will remember that they ever existed? In February 1946, Clara was invited to the American Military Hospital in Potsdam to work as a translator and nurse. It was a gathering of wounded Germans and Americans, men who had been on opposite sides of the front line, now housed together under the same temporary roof. One afternoon, as she was changing the bandages on an American patient with a shoulder injury, she stopped. That look, that voice, familiar. It was the soldier who had helped her when Berlin fell, the one who had carried her out of the Oranienburg station in the chaos. He recognized her first. I remember you. You cried when you saw the fire at the station. Clara nodded slightly, her eyes looking out the window where the snow was falling. I can't cry anymore. Maybe my tears died with the city. He was silent, then said softly, no, you're helping people live. That's how Berlin comes back to life. That sentence, seemingly simple, made her heart ache. Not everyone can talk about compassion in an age of sin. After the war, the Allies launched a campaign of denazification, forcing the German people to watch films of concentration camps, forcing them to look at the crimes of their own country. Clara was also called to such a screening in the old, burned-out theater. Black and white images appeared, corpses, sunken eyes, groups of people entering the camp and never coming out. She felt herself trembling, not from fear, but from guilt. She had believed the propaganda that German women should only be loyal and give birth to children for the nation. Now she understood that their silence was also a crime. After the screening, she walked alone through the ruined streets. Snow was falling, cold. On the wall, someone had written in charcoal, "We're wussten nichts, we know nothing." Clara stood there for a long time in front of that inscription. Then she said softly, "No, we knew, we just didn't want to see." That night, as she returned to the church, she heard a small singing voice coming from the cellar. A group of women were singing Leise rieselt der Schnee, an old German Christmas carol. Clara sat down and sang along. Her voice was hoarse but full of emotion. An older woman looked at her and said, "We are no longer people of the Reich, my child. We are only human beings, and humans need to sing to live." In the midst of the destruction of Berlin, the women continued to rebuild brick by brick. None of them knew what tomorrow would bring, but in those eyes, there was light again. Fragile but resilient light, like candles that never go out. Clara, in the last page of her diary, writes, "I don't know if Felix is still alive, but I believe when a child laughs, the world is reborn. And maybe that's why we're still here." Spring 1947 came late. The snow melted slowly on the streets that still smelled of gunpowder. Understood? The ruined walls were now covered with young grass shoots, the first green spots after 2 deadly winters. Berlin seemed to be waking up from a long, nightmare-filled sleep. The Americans brought many things, from powdered milk, old clothes, even cans of instant coffee the Germans had never seen before. In the morning, Clara and the Trümmerfrauen women gathered in front of the church, drinking a small cup of coffee from a single can. They didn't talk much. They just sat listening to the birds returning to the roof, a sound that no one had heard for 2 years of war. "This world still knows how to sing," Clara said softly, touching the chipped porcelain cup. One afternoon, as Clara was lighting a fire in the small kitchen, the wooden door opened slightly. A woman entered, thin, deep-eyed, and with trembling hands carrying an old suitcase. Clara froze. It was Ilse, her old friend who had been a nurse with her in 1943, who had disappeared after the bombing of Anhalter Station. Ilse was no longer the Ilse of the past. Her face was gaunt, her eyes were quiet, and on her wrist was a number engraved, a sign of someone who had been imprisoned in a concentration camp. No one asked her what she had been through. She only whispered, "I came back to learn to forgive." During the long nights, Clara and Ilse sat together in the church basement, telling stories. Clara told of her days working with the Americans, of the children she had saved, of the American soldier whose gentle eyes still bore the sadness of a victor. Ilse listened in silence, then said softly, "You know, Clara, I used to hate them, but in the camp, I met an American guard. He gave me a piece of cake. I cried because I realized that kindness has no nationality. That made Clara speechless. Amidst the ruins, people began to realize the enemy, after all, was just another human being, also afraid, also had a mother, a home, and their own pain. On May 8, 1947, Berlin held a memorial service 2 years after the end of the war. At St. Nikolai Church, hundreds of people gathered, each carrying a candle. Clara stood next to Ilse, watching the shimmering light reflect off the charred walls. The priest said during the ceremony, "We cannot live if we keep looking back, but we cannot move forward if we do not admit our mistakes." Everyone bowed their heads. A few men burst into tears. A soft song rang out, no longer a military song, but Brahms' Lullaby, a lullaby from old Germany. Ilse held Clara's hand and whispered, "The war took away the men, but it taught us women to love." In the summer of 1947, the sounds of children echoed in the streets of Berlin. Newborn babies, children of peace, grew up among the rubble, in the arms of mothers who were no longer afraid of falling bombs. Clara worked at an American relief center, distributing milk, medicine, and helping women give birth. Every time she heard a baby cry, her heart warmed. "This cry is proof that the world still goes on," she wrote in her diary. "I used to think that Germany would be buried in ashes forever, but perhaps peace does not blossom from politics, but from the hands of mothers." One day, Thomas, the American soldier she had met, returned to Berlin wearing an old military uniform. Mr. Tierque. He gave Clara a piece of paper, a permit to go to the US under the resettlement program. "You can start over, Clara, a new life." She looked at the paper for a long time, but then she shook her head slightly. "Thank you, but my homeland needs me more." He smiled sadly. "I understand. Perhaps sometimes courage lies not in leaving, but in staying." That autumn, Claire and Ilse rebuilt the first classroom in the Mitte district. The tables and chairs were made from scrap wood. Chalk was ground from lime. Paper was cut from cement bags. But in the eyes of the children, it was a miracle. Children, write the word peace. Write it in big letters," Clara said, her voice trembling but firm. The sunlight streamed in through the broken window, illuminating the dirty but radiant faces. It was the first morning after the war that Clara felt truly alive. Clara died many years later when Germany had changed. In her old room, a worn leather notebook was found, in which she wrote the last lines. "We do not need to be praised, we just need to be remembered. Because in every brick of Berlin, there is the hand of a forgotten woman." When read again, one realizes the war may have destroyed the city, but it was the German women who did not hold guns, but only shovels and hearts, who saved the soul of the nation. Background sounds, the gentle wind and the distant church bells. A deep voiceover begins. In 1946, when the troops withdrew, Berlin was left with only women, children, and ashes. They had no weapons, no medals, but they had hands, skinny but strong, to rebuild a fallen nation. For decades, people have talked about generals, about battles, about victories, but few people talk about the women in the ruins, about the women who silently carried bricks, carried water, and raised children amid the dust. History often forgets them because they did not shoot, did not hold power, but they were the ones who rebuilt the first foundations of peace. Berlin 1946 was not just a ruined city, it is a testament to the fact that no empire can be reborn without human compassion. German women like Clara, Ilse, and thousands of other anonymous Trümmerfrauen turned the destruction into a lesson for humanity. They did not excuse their sins, but they did not let shame overwhelm their humanity. When we walk on the clean streets of Berlin today, under each paving stone, we still see the handprints of those who survived the most devastating storm. And perhaps it is thanks to these people that Germany can stand up, face the past, and step into the future with eyes wide open. No more illusions, only courage and humility. If war is born from hatred, peace can only spring from tolerance. The forgotten women of history have taught us that even in the ashes, light can still find its way up. If you relate to this story, leave a comment. Tell us about the woman who makes you believe in kindness. Subscribe so we can continue to listen to the voices that have been forgotten by history. Because sometimes the past is not just what is lost, but a reminder for people not to lose themselves.